So, welcome this morning. We're going to have a session on beings and their environment. Danielle McNamara will be the actual respondent. But for now, we thought it would be better to start. So Martin will start. His presentation is called Artistic Consideration Arising in Writing and Producing a Buddhist Musical Comedy. So Martin Adam is an associate professor in Religion, Culture, and Society program at the University of Victoria, Canada. If you haven't been there, you should definitely go there. It's absolutely beautiful. He teaches in the area of Buddhist studies with research interest in Buddhist ethics, meditation theory and practice, mysticism, and most recently, Buddhism and theater. He has spent extensive periods studying in India and Nepal and holds a PhD in religious studies from McGill University. So please welcome with me warmly, Martin Adams.
Okay, you can put on the first slide. That would be great. All right, so thank you for coming this morning, everyone. The topic of my paper, I'm going to actually read through. I timed it out, so it's pretty much within the 20-minute span. But I'm going to be talking about this recent stage play production of a musical that I wrote over 6 years between 2016 and 2022. A little bit of the considerations that went into that project, which was pretty much all consuming. So I'm going to read through this, maybe pause at points for a couple of talking points. And then at one point, I will pause to play one of the songs from the musical and use that as an illustration of what I was attempting to do with this project. All right. So in this paper, I will attempt to demonstrate that Buddhist teachings can be successfully adapted to the unlikely artistic genre of a Broadway-styled musical, in spite of a number of unique challenges associated with the venture. I will argue this in reference to the script and songs of a recently produced stage play entitled What the Buddha Never Taught, a rock opera. I will show how two specific challenges, one artistic and one ethical, were overcome in the process of writing the script. The ethical concern was centered on questions of representation and cultural appropriation. The artistic concern pertained to the goal of writing a script that would simultaneously appeal to three distinct target audiences: the North American general public, scholars of Buddhist studies, and Western Sanghas. I will attempt to show how these challenges were met by reconceiving the writing process so as to be guided by Buddhist pedagogical principles, including right speech and skill and means. What the Buddha Never Taught is an adaptation of a popular book by Tim Ward, first published some 30 years ago. Its title, of course, is a play on Walpola Rahula's wonderful introduction to Buddhism, written in 1959 and published by Grove Press. Thanks. Yeah, that's great. What the Buddha Taught, which you're all familiar with. Tim Ward's book is an autobiographical account of a young Canadian philosophy student seeking enlightenment at an international monastery in northwest Thailand. The story, such as it is, concerns the spiritual ups and downs of the author as he and an American friend named Jim take their first awkward steps on the Buddhist path. Upon publication, the book met with mixed reviews. Much of Ward's book is critical of the inconsistencies he found to exist within the Thai Wat where he stayed. The most serious criticisms of the book were ethical in nature and concerned the motivations of the author. Was he ever really serious about learning the Buddha's way? Did he have a book in mind all along? Was he guilty of exploiting the generosity and openness of his hosts? What was his real motivation? There is a rather long and convoluted story concerning how it came to pass that in 2016, I found myself writing a stage play adaptation of this book. Needless to say, the initial idea for undertaking the project was fraught with doubt and uncertainty. Aside from my complete lack of experience as a playwright, I was acutely aware of the criticisms leveled at the book. It was therefore essential that I raise the same ethical questions for myself. What was my own motivation? Additionally, isn't there something inherently disrespectful about the idea of setting a musical in a Buddhist monastery? What could possibly serve as an academic rationale for such a project? It took me 2 years to answer these questions to my own satisfaction, and only then did I decide to seek permission of the author to write the adaptation. The possibilities presented by this project were compelling. It represented a unique opportunity to expose Buddhist teachings to a wider audience, most of whom would be unfamiliar with Buddhism. Thus, the play could serve as an invitation to the public at large, one that could open the door to the possibility that Buddhism just might have something to offer. At a minimum, it would offer the public a well-informed, entertaining, and respectful treatment of its subject matter, the Western encounter with Buddhism. In addition to the general public, the play could also have something to offer to two other audiences. For academics, the project represented a fascinating new prospect for study, namely that of presenting Buddhist philosophy on stage, a novel idea if ever there was one. I wanted to explore it. Finally, the project could be of considerable interest to different communities of Western Buddhist practitioners who would, perhaps, be able to recognize some of their own experiences in the events and issues explored in the play. So this next section is called the Buddhist Artistic Challenge. From the outset then, the script was conceived of as aiming at 3 different target audiences: a general public with no background in Buddhism, colleagues in the academic world, and the various communities of Western Buddhist practitioners. The initial artistic challenge would be to strike the right balance among them. The question became, how could the play address one audience without either boring or alienating the others? If, for example, the play was written from a Buddhist insider's perspective, it ran the risk of being perceived as a religious play, which would immediately alienate much of the secularly minded general public, not to mention the academic world. On the other hand, if the script was not sufficiently detailed and informative about Buddhism, it would likely be of little interest to academics and Buddhist practitioners. Finally, if the play was overly intellectual, it ran the risk of being hopelessly boring to anyone but an academic. In point of fact, this proved to be the most difficult initial stumbling block. Early drafts of the play were so heavily tilted towards the academic audience as to be stultifyingly dull. Filled with long, heady passages of dialogue and debate on topics ranging from the reality of rebirth to the Four Noble Truths, initial versions of the script just didn't work as theater. It soon became apparent that the writing process was demanding that I recreate myself as a writer. I needed to learn how to represent Buddhist ideas and sensibilities, not through argument and discussion, but by portraying them in action. Action, karma. I contemplated the relevance of the concept in the midst of my continuing research on the nature of theater and playwriting. As it turns out, the very word drama also means action, derived from the Greek verb dran, to do, to act, to perform. So it was that I was eventually able to re-articulate the nature of what I was trying to do with this project. It was nothing less than to engage in kushala drama, dharmic drama. To enact this goal, I would need to learn a new skill, namely that of writing in such a way as to allow Buddhist concepts and themes to be shown rather than stated in dialogue form. In this way, I was able to redefine the project's rationale. My goal would be to write a Buddhist play, not simply a play about Buddhism. The play would aim to serve as a living example of Buddhist pedagogical principles in action, upaya kaushalya. Only in this way could it reach its goal of appealing to all 3 of its intended audiences. Aside from the obvious sense in which such a balancing act can be understood as an attempt to practice skill and means as a writer, from an academic perspective, the very choice of musical as the artistic genre for the project could also be seen as an example of skillful means, since the musical of all art forms is among the most appealing and appropriate to Western audiences. The choice of a medium so foreign to Buddhism as traditionally understood is thus arguably consistent with Buddhism's anti-essentialist stance, a stance that opens the door to different possible modes of artistic expression depending on the intended audience. As a piece of Buddhist musical theater aimed at Western audiences, What the Buddha Never Taught was written with the intent of embodying this remarkable capacity. Okay, just give me a second here. So this next section is called the Buddhist Ethical Challenge. That said, to be a Buddhist play, the script would have to embody the basic moral principles of the tradition, which is to say, it would have to be guided by considerations of right speech, samyak vach. Most importantly, it should do no harm. For this reason, it was decided early on that the play should be focused on the Western experience of Buddhism rather than any living Asian Buddhist tradition. This consideration was critically important to me. I can't tell you how much I had to rework the script to make it focused on, Westerners as opposed to Thai Buddhists or any tradition like that. The motivation for this decision can be understood as having two related aspects, both of which can be characterized as right speech considerations. Principally, it has to do with avoiding inadvertent offense and possible hurt feelings, as occurred upon the publication of Tim Ward's book. The second concern pertained to possible charges of cultural appropriation and misrepresentation. Who was I to speak for traditions other than my own? The easiest way to avoid all such problems would be to keep representations of living Asian Buddhist traditions to an absolute minimum. The play was, after all, supposed to be a play about Western Buddhists, a group, incidentally, I felt very comfortable in writing about and perhaps having a bit of fun with. In the end, considerations of right speech would mean that an almost complete overhaul of the original book, including the elimination of all references to Thai Buddhist lineages, teachers, and traditions. Reimagining the book would also mean the introduction of a dramatic plot that could deliver on some key Buddhist themes. The upshot of Ward's book is perhaps best characterized as one of ambivalence towards Buddhism, and certainly about its adaptation in the West, or its adoption in the West, sorry. As we have seen, however, the play is intended in part as an invitation to explore Buddhism for oneself. To deliver on this goal, I would need to write a compelling, positively focused narrative that would express Buddhist themes such as compassion, the transformative power of meditation, and the middle way. So, I will close this paper by showing how I attempted to do this with reference to the two main characters of the play, Tim and Jim. Tim and Jim form a natural dyad, and their complementary personalities readily lend themselves to creative reinterpretation for the purpose of illustrating Buddhist teachings. Arriving at the monastery at approximately the same time, they soon form an unlikely friendship. Tim is an optimist, always looking on the bright side of life, sincerely interested in learning about the Buddha's way. Jim is a skeptic and a cynic. The Buddha's teachings? Well, that was so long ago, we can't really know what he actually taught. Throughout the play, the characters are developed in such a way as to illustrate particular Buddhist themes. They are like two sides of the same coin. Tim represents an eternalist position, a position that ultimately grounds his hope for the future. Jim's character symbolically represents annihilationism, and in the moments before the following song, which I'm going to play for you now, Jim admits to Tim that he has twice attempted suicide. That's actually in the book, too. Note that at the end of this song, a Buddhist monk, Yenaviro, of no fixed nationality, and there's a story there, I'll get to that later, but he doesn't represent any particular tradition, makes an appearance at the end of the song. So he offers an alternative vision to the two extremes represented by the lead characters. So if you could put that song on, that would be great. We'll listen to it. It's a pop song, so it's going to take about 2.5 minutes. So you can just sit back and enjoy. And after we get it going, you can put up the lyrics as well. Maybe scroll through them. So this song is called The Secret.
I've got a secret say. I can't quite believe it, but it's true that I will you probably guessed it. Round here, it's taboo. It's my little secret, but I'll share it with you. I believe in God. I believe in God. I believe in God somehow. Well, I got a secret. The truth can be hard. We have to be fearless and speak all words. I'd rather not keep it. It's so hard to bear. I'll just have to speak it, but you can't beware. Life's absurd. Life's absurd. Life's absurd. It all just ends one day. I believe life's absurd. I believe life's absurd. I believe in God. It all just ends one day. There is a secret no words can say. Look deep through the sorrow and listen and pray. The answer will come to you as a shape-shifting cloud afloats on silk bubble in the magic sky flower. And when you see clearly and drop all your views, you'll walk down the middle of eternal truth.
Great. So thanks. You can put the poster back up. That would be great. So the appearance of Yenaviro on stage at the end of this song is a rare one. Though his role in the play is minimal, his inclusion in the script was considered necessary in order to provide a contrast to the partial understandings and confused behaviors of the Western characters struggling to find a foothold on the path. He is intended to represent Buddhist wisdom in action. Originally a Nepali, by the time of the play's production, he had become a monk of no fixed address, a bit of a mystery to the Western novices who populate the stage. He is, by and large, an elusive figure, welcoming Tim upon his arrival at the Wat and seeing him off upon departure. On 2 occasions, he recites verses from the Dhammapada. His actions in general are meant to speak for themselves, compassionate, wise, and helpful. In the scenes following the song, where are we here? In the scenes following the song, having heard Yenaviro's words, Jim, the annihilationist, undergoes a very powerful meditation experience, one that transforms his self-understanding and softens his harsh attitude. In the end, he decides to stay on at the monastery. Thus, through the example of Jim's character development and personal transformation, at least 3 distinctive Buddhist themes are illustrated: the middle way, the power of meditative practice, and compassion. Each of the play's songs were written with the same goal in mind: to present Buddhist themes in an appealing, well-informed, non-doctrinaire manner. Thus, the goal of the songs, and there's 22 in the play itself, and there's a whole story there that took actually much of my time is to actually write those songs. But the theme of the songs is always, or the goal is always the same as that of the play: to reach as wide an audience as possible, including Western academics, practitioners, and the general public. In this way, I've attempted to demonstrate how the adoption of the artistic genre of the musical as a novel mode of artistic expression is entirely consistent with the spirit of the Buddha's teachings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it takes a lot of courage to write such a play. It's a very difficult exercise. And I can almost imagine in British Columbia, which is a society which is very community oriented, that these kinds of plays are actually important ways of talking about these issues. And in some way also that between the Western, we see the almost the mystical problems that we have in the West, not only with religious ideas, but even with wisdom, right? So having either the dualistic views of eternalism and nihilism. So this is very interesting to put it in that way. So thank you. I would like to invite the panel to ask some questions and maybe start the discussion.
Working? Okay. So I'm interested in these ethical questions that you mentioned in terms of how was this play received in terms of that. And also I have another question. Is there any chance of seeing this play in the future?
Yes. Okay, is this the mic I should speak into or this one? Okay, so in terms of the reception question, this is actually quite interesting. So as I said in the talk, I was aiming at 3 different audiences, and what actually happened, we got a pretty good turnout. The play actually, unfortunately, COVID hit the cast and me right in the middle of the production, so we had to cancel a lot of the shows. But of the shows that ran, it was about 2/3 of the shows we actually were able to run. We had a good turnout from the general public. Definitely there were members of the Western Sangha. Sadly, not too many academics came out in spite of some invitations, but it might have been just a little bit too way out for some of them. That's okay. But the ones who did come loved it, and there were a few. But what I wanted to say was the most surprising of all the audience responses was that the whole, it seemed like the word got out with through the Thai embassy actually that this play was going on. I'd actually talked to the Thai consul beforehand and let him know about it. And so the Southeast Asian community, mainly Thais and Burmese, showed up in force, and they, the play was written for Western audience, and they were Vancouverites now, West Coast people, but they loved it. I mean, I just didn't anticipate the response. I was out taking photographs, signing autographs, and at the end of the show, it's just crazy. They loved it so much. So that was the audience response. So happy surprise, unexpected surprise there. In terms of seeing it in the future, I definitely would like to see it produced again, but I don't want to be the producer. I mean, it was the most difficult thing I've ever done, maybe with the exception of a PhD thesis, somewhere on that category, and level. It was just so much work. There was so much coordination. I had to work with professional artists, a whole new realm, basically. And then, everybody had their own ideas about what it should look like on stage as well. And so I can tell you about that too, but I had to rein in some stuff that I didn't find appropriate. And so there was lots of things. So I don't want to touch it as a producer again. I'm happy to hand it off to another theater group. And, I'm looking to publish the play so that it's accessible to others. So yes, I hope to have it produced. A fantasy would be to have it produced in Kathmandu, actually. But we'll see. Yeah.
So in your introduction and in your conclusion, you sort of presented this idea as something quite novel, and I think by that you mean a sort of Western musical adaptation. And I think it's super exciting and novel and fresh. And I think I probably speak for the other panelists when I say we'd probably all like to see it. That said, I'm curious. There is sort of several ancient Buddhist sort of theatrical traditions, South Asian traditions. Also, one comes to mind, Ache Lhamo, into the Tibetan tradition, which is also a sort of musical theatrical tradition rooted in the Buddhist tradition. I'm just curious, not that you have to, or this was your goal to sort of engage with those other traditions in any way. I'm just curious if those influenced your writing process in any way.
So the answer to that is no, they didn't. I was made aware of some of these as I wrote the script. Some people pointed out to me that, you know, that there were indigenous native to Southeast Asia as well, traditions that were, but I was focused on the Broadway style musical because it was supposed to be for the North American audience. So I was also attempting not to do something which could be seen as cultural appropriation of any kind, which is, you know, the great sin right now in the academic world. You don't want to do that, and there's good reasons for that. And so I tried not to be influenced by other traditions. I actually wouldn't even look at the Book of Mormon. I could have gone, like, I just didn't want to be influenced. I wanted it to be its own thing, right? I didn't want to copy or be influenced by anything else. I had my own ideas of where to go with it, for better or worse. Yeah.
So we'll continue the discussion. I'm sure there is more question that will come up for you.
Sure.
And we definitely hope that if there is anyone interested in producing your play,
Sure.
that we can do it here in Kathmandu. So our next speaker today is Andrew Hallahan, and his talk is called Mapping the Hidden Lands, Depiction of Himalayan Buddhist Paradise. And Andrew, Andrew, I think there is another name also that you had. You have a Sanskrit name? Ananta. Oh. So hidden lands, secret names, we're looking forward to. So he grew up in Chicago and Nashville in the US and received his BA from Colorado College in the mountains of Colorado. After undergrad, Andy worked in Rajasthan, India as a teacher and a humanitarian aide, eventually enrolling at RYI. He received his MA degree in Buddhist Studies at RYI in 2020. Upon completion of his dissertation, which focused on the belief in place-based gods and spirit among Himalayan Buddhists, and the significance of sacred geography and hidden lands throughout Himalayan history. Since then, Andy has been teaching a variety of subjects in Thailand and contributed research and continued researching his current interest on the intersection of paradise, logic, and visionary expression. So we're really looking forward to this now. So please welcome with me, Andrew Hallahan.
Thank you, Dion, for that introduction. You can go ahead and get started with the slideshow on the first slide. Oh, there we are. So slight change of title from what I submitted earlier. It's called Mapping the Hidden Lands, Locating Paradise. So scattered along the southern slopes of the Himalaya lay Bayul, which are valleys of enchanting beauty, abundant resources, and were, according to Tibetan Buddhist accounts, concealed as inaccessible otherworldly sanctuaries by the legendary tantric master Padmasambhava, so that the faithful followers of Dharma might be able to, in the future, find refuge there from the enemies of their religion and live a life of happiness free from all earthly suffering. Baeyul, often referred to as hidden lands or hidden valleys, are believed to have been established by Padmasambhava during his travels through the Himalaya. Padmasambhava is thought to have taken almost every route through the mountains that connects India to Tibet and China, specifying some 108 hidden locations where tertans, or treasure revealers, can reveal treasures and refuges for meritorious individuals from all strata of Tibetan society during a time of moral and political degeneration, as well as a place of accomplishment for those who are spiritually inclined. As a place of security and refuge, Baeyul are an ideal location for settlements and fertile landscape protected by towering mountains and frozen, precarious mountain passes. Intrinsic to the value of a Baeyul is the representation of nature and landscape deriving from Tibetan tradition of mystic geography, which has a very important place in the visionary imagination of Himalayan society and religion, in which territory gods, called Yullah, and Dharma protectors, Chösung, tamed by Padmasambhava, abide in sacred mountains. Next slide, please. Next slide. So Baeyul are often located with the help of classical Tibetan guidebooks called Lamyik or Neyik that depict the Baeyul as geographical mandala. In contemporary English and Tibetan literature, Baeyul are almost always referred to as paradises, hidden away from those that may do harm to practitioners of the Dharma. Interestingly, the most famous of all Baeyul, Shambhala, or often called Shangri-La, carries a legacy of being a once glorious kingdom now lost in this degenerate age, similar to the concept of paradise lost prevalent in global religious mythologies. So the presentation, I will cover Baeyul, spelled there in Tibetan Wylie script, hidden lands of the Himalaya. We will briefly cover Tibetan guidebooks. I will showcase 3 depictions of Baeyul, namely Langtang, called Namgo Dagam, Sikkim, also called Demoshong, and the most famous of all, Baeyul Pemaka. I will showcase some AI-generated images based entirely on Tulshuk Lingpa's Neyik to Demoshong, called the creeper plant of the mind. I will discuss the roots of the word paradise and how it is rooted in a Persian word, and Islamic influences in South Asia that may have contributed to the trajectory of this idea of paradise into Asia. And then lastly, I will end with asking the question and leaving the question open: is Baeyul a paradise? And is this the appropriate terminology to use to describe Baeyul? Next slide, please. So the idea of the Baeyul first appears to be a uniquely Tibetan and Himalayan phenomenon, and many scholars have studied the topic. Connections have been made between Baeyul and Buddhist cosmology, medicine, politics, and environmentalism. However, according to Siddha of Kami, the idea of a Baeyul is not entirely unique to the Himalaya and can be traced to Indian tantric literature and the identification of sacred natural sites, which act as portals between the mundane physical world and the Buddha realms, such as Shukavati. Siddha of Kami elaborates that the idea of Baeyul combines the common wish for earthly paradise with the tradition of pilgrimage. From the Tibetan perspective, Baeyul is neither entirely psychological nor geographical, but a dimension that can only manifest between the two when mind and landscape become transparent to each other in non-dual space. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I have 2 pictures of some of the first people to write guidebooks to Baeyul. On the left is Rigzin Göki Demtruchen, alive in the 14th century. He is the first writer of Neyik or Lamyik text to describe the location of many Baeyul, notably 8 of them scattered throughout the Himalayas, and he founded the Jangter school of treasure revealers, the Northern Treasure School. On the right is the Terton who opened the valley of Langtang as a Baeyul. His name is Rigzin Nida Longsel. He was employed by a king of Gungtang to locate the Baeyul Namgo Dagam because they were under attack by foreign invaders. Guidebooks to Baeyul, or sometimes referred to as passports, were written in Tibet from the 13th to the 18th centuries, which describe the location of Baeyul and the often arduous passages into Baeyul. These guidebooks contain tantric practices that were useful for pacifying protector deities, as well as the mandalic positioning of sites that mark the locations of treasure, ter. While the Lamyik and Neyik did not resemble the maps of today, they were the precursor to modern Tibetan maps to Baeyul and provided detailed instructions for anyone qualified enough to encounter them. Lamyik were typically written in the form of a dialogue between a master and a disciple, typically between a disciple of Padmasambhava and Padmasambhava himself. And they contain detailed descriptions of the rituals that the disciple had to perform in order to enter the Bayul. The disciple was required to undertake a dangerous journey through treacherous terrain and overcome many obstacles, both physical and spiritual. The Lamyik were not just practical guidebooks. They were also imbued with mystical symbolism. The mandalic positioning of the sites that marked the locations of treasure was meant to represent the spiritual journey that the disciple was required to perform, a specific ritual at each site in order to gain access to the next level of Bayul. The maps were, therefore, not just a physical representation of the landscape, but also a spiritual guide that could help the disciple navigate the inner landscapes of his mind. Next slide, please. So typically, Lamyik texts position the Bayul in question in the center of a mandala, unlike maps where we might see locations depicted anywhere and the center is not really important. In this case, the center is always important. North, south, east, west orientation of gateways into the Bayul. Centuries ago, Tibetan and Himalayan peoples did not use cartographic maps the way we do now. They used literary maps that provided specific physical and ritual instructions to enter the Bayul, and the directions to the Bayul, as well as ritual instructions for pacifying protector deities. Modern renditions of these guidebooks, expressed as landscape paintings and drawings, are often called sabtra, which literally means variegated countryside in Tibetan. Next slide, please. So here is an image depicting Langtang in the center of a mandala. Rigzin Nida Langsel is attributed to opening Bayul Namgo Dagam, also known as Langtang, in 1680, when, under the tutelage of Garwang Dorje in Kirang, he was given the instruction to locate and open the Bayul, as prophesied by the famous Terten Rigzin Göki Demtruchen. The first text was locating where exactly Namgo Dagam is, and based on the prophecy said to be first uttered by Padmasambhava and recovered by Demtruchen, the Bayul in question is placed in the center of a sacred mandala, with Yolmo to the south, Mangyul to the west, Nyanang to the east, and Peltang to the north. It is easy to reach, it lies near to Tibet, and is an extremely secure location, with extremely stressed in the Nayik. Here we see a clear example of the usage of mandalic positioning to locate Bayul Namgo Dagam in the center of a mandala. Next slide, please. And this is in Rasua district in Nepal. So the physical Bayul occupies space in the center of a mandala, functioning as a map. The spatial mapping function of visual representation in a mandala constitutes a sacred space conceived as a cognitive graphic of an area that is seen as becoming real, is virtually inhabited, and entered into by the observer, who then navigates through it on a mental pilgrimage. In this sense, mandalas are maps that exist in the material world but depict an imaginal world patterning, directly affecting inner structuring of physical and mental senses through a world picture reflecting the brain's perceptions of its environment, which then becomes imbued with a sacred presence. To fully appreciate the nature of the mandala's usefulness as a map, the mandala must be understood as a physically existing entity that metaphorically represents a multidimensional space. This type of space can range from a tangible world portrayed on a mundane map to a space visualized as three-dimensional dreamlike mirage, to a purely metaphysical mind training exercise. Before the 20th century, Tibetans didn't use maps as much as they used verbal and literary descriptions of space. In Western literature and academia, the notion of a map derives from paper maps of classical cartography, depicting the Earth's surface oriented in the four cardinal directions. There have long been graphic maps depicting Tibet and her neighboring lands called Shinkepa, or arrangement of a region or field. These maps have been employed sparingly throughout Tibetan history to depict topographic landscape features, much in line with the Western cartographic concept. But Tibetan maps have been employed mostly to depict other perceived world systems of Mahayana Buddhism, mandalas, cosmograms, and the paradisiacal landscapes of alternative realities, such as the hidden lands themselves. This style of painting world systems in the form of a mandala, in many cases, were not utilized to navigate the landscape itself, but to navigate the mental and spiritual landscapes of Buddha fields and the nature of the inner mind. Next slide, please. Here we have two images that are from the Bayul Demoshong, also known as Sikkim. On the left is a cave located underneath Mount Kanchenjunga, where it is believed that Padmasambhava himself meditated. And on the right, we can see a terton opening a beyul with khandro. Notice the ritual implements behind the opening. And these are located on a temple wall in Tashiding Gompa in Sikkim. Next slide, please. Here I have two AI-generated images of Tulshik Lingpas, the creeper plant of the mind. And while you guys look at that, I will read you what I input into the AI generation machine. Then the hermit, making some gestures with his fingers, addressed me thus in a very sweet voice. Emaho, in the east of this hidden land, the 5 summits of the snowy mountains assume the air of a lion. Beneath are precious lakes containing milk-like nectar, and a number of hidden treasure caves containing precious stones and crystals. In the south, where rainbows and clouds have covered the black forests, you will find abundant resources of silk and food. In the west, where there are forests of medicinal plants, there are also mines containing gold, silver, iron, copper, and many other innumerable treasures, as well as other materials for household purposes. In the north, where hail and rain fall over the snowy mountains, there are miraculous treasure caves of arms and weapons. There are also wonderful mines that preserve religious treasures, such as images and writings of the Buddha, in all 4 directions, in the center, as well as in the bordering areas. There are numberless treasures of household goods to fulfill all one's needs. In the valleys, hills, and forests, one comes across uncountable varieties of medicine and food, as well as the elementary materials for silk clothes and different kinds of paints. There are no other paths leading to this place. The instruments, names of places, and other important keys, like a road guide for the opening of doors of this place, lie in the 5 great caves and at Tashiding. So I took this text translated from Tibetan into English and I input it into a machine called DAL-E, which is owned by the same company that started ChatGPT. On the left, I just put in the text itself and it gave me this almost miraculous image of a mandala. I didn't even instruct it to portray it as a mandala, and it did it on its own. On the right, I asked it to portray it as a mandala, and all of a sudden we see kind of an emphasis on the 4 cardinal directions, and in the middle, we have Tashiding Gompa itself. Next slide, please. On the left here is Sabtra. So this would be an example of a landscape drawing that is based on Neyik and Lamyik texts. So this is a drawing of Sikkim. On the top left, you see Kanchenjunga. In the middle, sort of the black stupa in the middle there would be Tashiding Gompa, which is described as the very heart of the beyul. On the right side, just above the text, is AI generated via Stable Diffusion, another text-to-image generator. This one, I did not have any mention of deities or goddesses, and on its own, it produced this amazing image of a Buddhist goddess or bodhisattva situated between 2 mountains in a valley, something that surprised me very greatly. Next slide, please. These are pictures from Ian Baker's famous book, The Journey to the Heart of the World, where he is said to have opened Beyul Pemako. So above is the famous picture of the bend of Pemako. And on the right is a very, very old drawing by a Tibetan explorer, drawn probably in 1889, but published in 1895 in the Journal of the Royal Geographic Society. And it's a drawing of the Tsangpo River waterfall, also called Dorje Pagmo. And if you look very, very carefully in the waterfall, you can see a tantric deity and a human skull. Next slide, please. So moving on to the roots of paradise. The concept of paradise is not at all unique to Tibetan traditions, but has roots in many different cultures and religions throughout history. In Persian mythology, paradise is depicted as a garden of ever-blooming flowers and abundant fruit, where the righteous will be rewarded with eternal life. The Greeks and Romans conceived of a golden age and islands of the blessed. One of the earliest examples of paradise is found in the Hebrew account of the Garden of Eden, which is described as a lush and abundant garden created by God for the first humans, Adam and Eve. The Garden of Eden is depicted as a paradise, or more accurately, as a walled garden, where the first humans lived in harmony with nature and God. The story of paradise begins in ancient Persia with the Medes. Alessandro Scaffi speculates that a Median word, possibly paridaisa, passed to the Persians to signify a lush enclosure, from pari, meaning around, and daisa, meaning a wall made of a malleable substance, such as clay. In ancient Iran, the word stood for something surrounded by a wall, particularly a lush garden. Paridaisa also appeared in ancient Greek as paradisos, showing the term was adopted cross-culturally from early on by Xenophon, a 4th century Greek soldier and historian. From Persia, paradise was embraced by the Hebrews and later by the early Christians of the Middle East, with the images of heaven as a paradisiacal garden, or paradisos, appearing on many occasions in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. We can also see some cognates of the word in modern spoken Nepali, in Paradesh, meaning foreign country, and we'll go back to that. Nowadays, however, the word paradise has been reappropriated for commercial purposes by the tourist industry. Globally, advertisements for holidays promise paradise to stressed urbanites in the shape of some distant but welcoming luxurious natural environment, a place no more than a simple flight away in which they can relax from the pressures and worries of the world. The notion of paradise is clearly not restricted to any singular religion, reflecting rather a fundamental human need to experience in one form or another a nostalgia for the blessed state we call paradisiacal. However, this nostalgia is named, or whatever form it is given, a perfect joy experienced at the beginning of time, or one that awaits us at time's end, or that is hidden in a secluded place, or that existed in a mythological golden age. The common thread is that paradise remains inaccessible to living people, and that it is outside ordinary human time. Next slide, please. So these are some images of medieval European maps that often sought to locate the Garden of Eden on a map. And as you can see, the Garden of Eden is always depicted as a walled square garden in every single European map that I could find. This one is created in 1573 in France, in Lyon, and is kept in the British Library in London. Next slide, please. Here is one of the most famous maps of medieval Europe. This is called the Mappa Mundi, or Map of the World. This is the largest example of any kinds of maps, believed to have been created in England at around 1300 CE. It's the largest medieval map of the world known to exist. And notice that the map is centered on the Mediterranean, a kind of distorted version of the Mediterranean, and that square structure on the left zoomed in version, some people believe to be the rendition of where the Garden of Eden was located. Next slide, please. So moving on to Islamic influences on paradise. According to Islamic travelers, writers, and visionaries of Persia, the Middle East and Northern Africa, India is always portrayed as a sacred landscape because it is believed to be the location where Adam landed after his exile from Eden. Interestingly enough, according to the same belief, Eve did not land in the same place as Adam did. She landed in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Moreover, according to Sufi and Islamic scholar Dr. Karl Ernst, by the 1600s, there were 1.5 million literate writers of Persian in India, whereas there were only about 150,000 literate writers of Persian in Persia herself. This shows that the transference of the term paradise to India is entirely plausible. There are more writers in India, 10 times more writers in India of Persian than there were in Persia itself. Following along with the history of India, multiple Muslim conquests of India, from the Turks, Abbasids, Muhammad of Ghazni to the Mughals, there is undoubtedly an Islamic influence on Indian ideas of sacred geography. Looking at Mughal royal architecture, we can find the example of walled pleasure gardens repeatedly in their art and architecture. And the Buddhist Islamic interactions along the Silk Road have been confirmed by Johan Elverskog in his book, Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road. Next slide, please. So in this image is a Mughal painting from Agra in the 16th century. Here we see this square repetition of the pleasure garden. And it sort of takes on a little bit of a mandalic form. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. Next slide. These are some interesting images that I saw. The most famous of all Mughal pleasure gardens is, of course, the Taj Mahal. This is a watercolor painting from a British person in 1814, 1815, views by Sitaram from Delhi to Tughlaqabad. And on the left is the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad's ascent to heaven from a miniature made to illustrate a copy of the poems of Nizami, published in Persia, 1540. You can notice that the face of Muhammad has not been painted because it is against the rules to depict the prophet. It is also against the rules to depict paradise itself. So they only depicted his ascent into paradise. Next slide, please. So, moving on, could we say that Bayul are paradise? All of these paradises are a reflection of the past, a reference to the present, and an anticipation of the future. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer drew attention to the way that the enchantment of distance reveals paradises, which then evaporate like a mirage. Schopenhauer likened happiness to a small dark cloud overhead, driven by the wind, over a sunny plain. All before, behind, and around is bright light, but only where you stand is the dark cloud itself, which casts a shadow. Schopenhauer's analogy draws on the concept of paradise lost, and we can see a rendition of the same figure of speech. The grass is always greener on the other side. So, is it appropriate to call Bayul paradises? Not exactly, but Bayul shares some significant similarities with the original meaning of the word. The concept of paradise lost is prevalent in many religious traditions, particularly Christianity and Islam, where it refers to the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. This loss of paradise is often seen as a metaphor for the human condition, characterized by sin, suffering, impermanence, and the struggle for meaning and purpose in life. In Tibetan Buddhism, the concept of realization or liberation offers a different way of understanding the human condition and the nature of the world. This concept involves the recognition of the true nature of reality, which is said to be free from suffering and impermanence. Unlike the Abrahamic conception of paradise, human beings can access the paradisical Bayul in this lifetime with the right combination of faith, spiritual conduct, and pure vision, and maybe a touch of crazy adventurousness. Furthermore, within Lamyik and Nayik literature, Bayul are described as existing on several levels: outer, inner, and innermost, or secret. These levels of viewing a Bayul correspond with the physical, mental, and spiritual spheres. Rather than seeking to regain a lost paradise, the focus is on achieving a state of inner peace and freedom from attachment and delusion. While the idea of paradise lost and realization and liberation may seem contradictory, they are actually complementary in certain respects. In Buddhism, the recognition of the true nature of reality is said to lead to a state of inner peace and freedom that transcends the suffering and impermanence of the world. This state is often described as a kind of paradise or blissful state, but is not something that is lost or regained. Rather, it is a state of being that is available to all who are willing to cultivate the necessary skills and awareness. Next slide, please. So to finish off, what is paradise for you? This is a picture I took up in Langtang of some very happy yaks living in their version of paradise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a very interesting talk. We go from the land of Victoria, which is some kind of a bayul, to Himalayan bayuls, to non-referential bayuls. And so thank you very much. I will open the discussion amongst us, and then we'll have a break, and after which we will gather back. So please, if you have any question for Andrew, yes.
So thank you. That was a very stimulating and wide-ranging presentation. And I'm wondering, just in terms of your research, the obvious maybe next step, or maybe you've taken the step. My question is whether you've explored the literary dimensions of this. In the obvious one is Milton and Paradise Lost, and you have other utopian type literature in the West, with Huxley and others. And so, in terms of your comparative study of this concept, is there something to be gained by going into the literary world for this? And have you started in on that?
Yeah. I've started in looking a little bit, especially there was a painting that I saw, or a drawing, and it was Utopia. It was Thomas More's Utopia. And what was interesting about that is that he sought to locate paradise, again, on this kind of mappa mundi, but he spelled it UT, like utopia, like And that was a misspelling from the original Greek. The original Greek was supposed to say good place, but he described it as no place. So there is an interesting kind of distinction there between like viewing the paradise as an actual good place on earth or viewing it as really no place, a sort of figment of the imagination, a mirage of something that is always sought after but never truly achieved.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to say there because utopia and paradise are different concepts themselves, right? They're both sought after, longed for, but utopia always strikes me as more of a a construction. It's like an imagined society, right? Whereas the idea of a paradise strikes me as more of a natural state. If that's a fair contrast. I'm just thinking off the.
I think that's a fair contrast. Yeah, yeah. I think the connotations of the word paradise have always been sort of natural. The idea of a garden is there, and if we look at Himalayan Bayul, they kind of are a paradise in that sense. They're always described as being lush and abundant with resources, a sort of tropical land defended by a wall, snowy mountains that keep it protected from foreign invaders. And they specifically mention that in almost every single guidebook to Bayul is always about defense from foreign invaders.
That actually.
That theme of defense actually kind of segues into the exact question that I had. I was thinking about this notion of the mandala as a sort of way of orienting space, and those who are familiar with tantric Buddhist visualization practice, the mandala is often associated, well, exclusively almost, I might not say exclusively, but usually associated with a deity and the arrangement of a deity's sort of palace. And you did mention like Dorje Pakmo and deities located in certain waterfalls and certain places to propitiate certain protectors but in the image of the mandalic orientation of, I think it was Langtang, I didn't see any explicit representation of saying, this is where the central deity resides. These are where these deities reside. So my first sort of part of my question is, do you find that in the Nayik and the Lamyik sort of like this deified aspect? And then the B part to my question then is, I wonder also how this notion of the mandala intersects with the notion of the Tsong or the fortress, because there does seem to be sort of also a militaristic kind of component here as the notion of sort of a protective fortress with this sort of wall. So
yeah, absolutely. So on your first question, in the Nayik, it's usually described in 3 different sections. So you have like an outer description of where it's located physically. And so that map where I'm positioning Langtang, that was just my own drawing based on Nayik. So I'm not an artist. I can't draw the Yula in the middle of that. But when you get to the second and third sections, especially in third sections where it's describing Bayul as very esoteric, really sort of a mandala palace in the mind. And in the center is always the Yula, the main protector deity, surrounded by 4 to 16 additional protector deities that can range between Nagas or Tsenpo, which is a very unique Tibetan kind of red, wrathful, militaristic deity. And so that goes to your second question of, yes, in depictions of Bayul, you'll often have, like in the Sabtra one of Sikkim, Kashiding is kind of depicted as a fortress that can be defended. And those are in the Nayik as well. Pretty much always in the Nayik, that if an invading army were to come in, this is a very perfect place to be able to defend. And there's a wonderful story in Langtang where when the Gorkha armies were seeking to conquer all of Nepal, that an old couple in Langtang, they threw buckets of water on the hillside and waited overnight for it all to turn into ice. And then when the heavy armored and heavily armed soldiers marched up to Langtang, they slipped down the hill and up. And it's an image of an old Tibetan grandma and grandpa just laughing at them. I find that to be wonderful.
Just one last question from my side. So the AI generated images are quite interesting. I think your thought of trying it out is already an interesting idea. But so these AI images are drawing from what's on the internet. So that's the information they're driving from.
Basically, yes, but they're also learning machines. So you can give them feedback. So when maybe you can bring up that slide where I have the two pictures, the AI generated pictures. The left one, I just put in the basic information from the NAIC, but then on the right one, I gave it a little bit of guidance. I said, okay, do that same thing, but now put it in mandalic form. And so it sort of tried to, these machines really just try to please you. They try to just give you exactly what you're looking for. But I didn't ask it to put it in mandalic form on the left. That's what's really interesting to me. It did it on its own. And so I wonder what exactly it's drawing on the internet.
All right,
do
the
that.
language, some of the language, the way that it's worded. So drawing from similarities possibly. But I just thought there was a link here with Anne Schaftel's talk, right, about preserving. But here we have a kind of a preservation invention. So from drawing from preservation to innovation kind of thing, right? So that's an interesting.
And the machine will surprise you. So on the next slide where I have the image of the goddess in between the two mountains, the text never said anything about any deities. Yet it's basically a picture of a deity. So, and it's sort of interesting to your question as well, Westin, like, you know, with these maps, like where did the deities come in? And it's like the machine already knew that, which I found to be incredibly fascinating. I have dozens of these photos, so if you guys want to see some more, please ask me.
Is this some sort of writing here, or is that just like a watermark?
So sometimes these machines will create kind of gibberish gobbledygook to look like writing when it just means nothing, because they're, it's almost like they're blind.
Looks almost like prayer flags or something.
Mm.
So let's break out now, if you don't mind. And then we have 15 minutes. It's not ready yet. Oh, we had to confirm 10 o'clock for today. We did it again. So
10:13.
We
So-
can take more questions, you know.
Yeah, we
Yep.
can do more questions.
let's do that. Thank you, Father Greg. So any question from ground? Yes, John?
Thank you, both of you. I'm just going to address Martin's work for the moment, but these were both great presentations. Thank you, both of you. What would you say, and what can you say diplomatically? I guess you have to be diplomatic about this. What was the reaction of your colleagues to your work? I mean, mine, I remember a couple of years ago when I learned about the development of your production was enthusiastic, and I think it's great. But, you know, in terms of academia, it kind of pushes the boundaries of what people are willing to consider interdisciplinary. So
Yeah.
I'm just, as a Buddhist studies scholar, what can you say about that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question. I think because it was, so there's the reactions I received about the project from academics who attended the play. And also I put on 2 staged readings beforehand to be building up to the actual performance. So I put on one show at the University of Victoria, and that drew a lot of people from different departments, and including theater and Pacific and Asian Studies, the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. And universally, the reaction was positive, so positive, like people were amazed that this was being done. So anybody who saw the play loved it, okay? But in terms of actually promoting it and getting people on board with it, it was much harder. And I did a fundraising campaign, which may have also been an unusual thing for an academic to do. I did a Kickstarter. This was a very expensive project. And so I did a Kickstarter campaign, and tried to generate interest in the academic world through that, and not just academic, in the public at large. But very little uptake from academics. There was more the public at large. And so I do think that the project raised eyebrows, for sure. I mean, like, people are kind of scratching their head. What in heaven's name do you think you're doing? You know, like, really, that's the kind of reaction I was getting from good friends, actually. And I had to say, look, you know, this actually, there's, you know, I don't know what possessed me, but it's legit. You know, it's actually, there's some merit to this, and there is a good academic rationale for it, which I talked about in the paper. So I think two ways of answering it. Yeah, there's sort of a lukewarm, tepid response in terms of actually getting the thing going and getting support from colleagues that way. But in terms of actually having it witnessed by people, both at the stage reading and the few who showed up for the actual performance, it was wild enthusiasm. Yeah.
Here, we're going to continue our panel on beings and their environments and the creation of worlds and spaces. Next, we are going to hear from Westin Harris, who is a graduate student at University of California at Davis, a very well-known, recognizable member of our beloved community, whose work focuses, practically speaking, on chud, on architecture, and the relationships, particularly between Tantric Buddhism and the Nath Sampradaya, the Shaiva kind of prototypical Tantric traditions. And here he's going to speak to us about the mandala in which we presently abide, and hopefully offer us some ways to engage with it productively while we're here. Please.
As Georgiela is pulling up my slides, before my time starts, I'll just say that I have a lot of images and material that I'm excited to share with you all. So I'm going to speak a little bit quickly maybe, and if it's difficult for anybody to understand, just know that I will be posting my slides on my academia.edu page afterwards, so you can read my paper with footnotes and citations there. Georgiela, if you could start the presentation, please. My talk today is called On the Mandala's Margins, Nepalese Siddha Images and the Architecture of Sacred Space. Much has been written about the metaphor of the mandala in Nepal. On the micro level, Himalayan tantric traditions envision the human body as a mandala filled with deities. On the meso level, many temples and cities are constructed according to the principle of the mandala. And on the macro level, the entire Kathmandu Valley itself is regarded as a mandala. In the creation of these mandalic spaces, art and architecture play a central role. For example, in most Nepalese temples, the primary deity resides inside a central shrine, while the temple exterior showcases images of peripheral mandalic deities, like the directional guardians, or Dikpala, the 8 mother goddesses, or Ashtamatrika, and the 8 Bhairavas, or Ashtabhairava. These marginal deities often number 8 or 10 to correspond with the 8 or 10 directions, thus emphasizing the notion of the mandalic circle surrounding the temple's central deity. In this paper, I will showcase several Nepalese images of yet another group of 8 or sometimes more peripheral beings, namely the Siddhas, or perfected adepts, who are said to inhabit 8 charnel grounds that constitute the outermost territory of a visualized mandala according to Buddhist tantras. While scholars have paid relatively more academic attention to Nepalese representations of Dikpalas, Matrikas, and Bhairavas, depictions of the 8 charnel ground Siddhas have received much less attention, particularly in Nepal. Therefore, my primary objective for this paper is to introduce these fascinating Siddha images into academic discourse while emphasizing the uniquely Nepalese brand of cross-sectarian hybridity that makes them so innovative. Depicted in wood, stone, and metallic relief, as well as in painted media, and dating from at least the 17th century onward, these Siddhas sometimes appear within or alongside the 8 charnel grounds in which they are said to reside. However, in many cases, they are depicted without any charnel ground iconography. Nonetheless, even when the charnel grounds are not explicitly represented, I argue that Nepalese images of the charnel ground Siddhas came to serve as artistic shorthand for the 8 peripheral charnel grounds with which they are so closely associated. I further contend that by acting as substitutive symbols for the 8 charnel grounds, these Siddha images serve as mandalic boundary makers, demarcating the perimeters of their respective structures' transformative space. A brief history of the 8 chronogrounds. Next slide, please. By the end of the first millennium CE, Buddhist yogini tantras had developed the notion of the Ashtasmashana, or the 8 chronogrounds, which are to be visualized around the perimeter of a meditational deity's mandala. Residing on the periphery, not fully inside the mandala, but not fully outside it either, the 8 chronogrounds are said to host a variety of liminal beings, like theriomorphic site protectors, or kshetrapala, chthonic serpent spirits, or nagas, oath-bound Vedic directional protectors, or dikpala, semi-divine wizards, or vidyadhara, and perfected ascetics called siddhas. While the earliest South Asian sources do not identify these siddhas by name, later textual and artistic sources begin to associate specific chronogrounds with specific siddhas. By the 14th century CE, Himalayan Buddhist traditions had developed a semi-standardized group of 8 well-known siddhas to associate with the 8 chronogrounds. While there are occasional variations, this semi-standard group usually includes Indraputi, Dombiheruka, Nagarjuna, Kantapa, Padmavajra or Virupa, Luipa, Hukuripa, and Shabaripa or Saraha. The 8 chronogrounds in Nepal. Several centuries later, the Kathmandu Valley experienced a remarkable period of artistic, architectural, and literary flourishing under the late Malla rulers of the 17th century. This era also catalyzed a new period of innovation with regard to the 8 chronogrounds and siddhas. These developments include, next slide, please. These developments include innovations in sectarian iconography and context, that is, despite their association with Buddhism, the chronoground siddhas sometimes appear sporting the markers of initiated Nath yogis, wearing Singna Jainus, a sacred thread with a whistle worn by initiated Naths, seen here in this Mughal era image. You can see the whistle around the neck, or the Singna Jainu, and Nath-style hats. Keep in mind this sort of bowler-looking hat that we see here. You'll notice this in the Nepalese images, as well as other Nath insignia. Similarly, the 8 chronogrounds and siddhas begin to appear in ostensibly Shaiva spaces, and depictions of the 8 chronogrounds begin to include 8 Shivalingas in addition to the 8 Buddhist chaityas. Other innovations include changes in the quantity of siddhas, that is, the standard number of 8 siddhas sometimes swells to 10 or 12, often to include siddhas revered by Nath yogis like Matsyendranath, Gorakshanath, Kanhapanath, and others. Changes in identities of the siddhas. That is, standard figures like Virupa, Luipa, Kukuripa, and Nagarjuna are almost always present in the Nepalese examples, but variations occur in the identities of other siddhas. The case of Jayabageshwari in Chabahil. Gudrun Bunneman has spearheaded much of the significant scholarship on the 8 chronogrounds in siddhas in Nepalese art and architecture. Next slide, please. In 2 such studies, she examines the novel appearance of 8 Shivalingas within the 8 chronogrounds and the unique case of the 8 chronogrounds appearing in a Bhairava mural at Jayabageshwari Temple in Chabahil. Regarding the latter, Bunneman theorizes that such detailed appearances of the 8 chronogrounds and siddhas are relatively rare in Shaiva contexts. However, as I have argued elsewhere, and as this paper will further demonstrate, the 8 chronogrounds and siddhas appear more frequently in Shaiva spaces than was originally hypothesized. You can see Virupa here wearing that Nath style bowler hat. Next slide, please. Furthermore, while it's loading there we go. Furthermore, Bunneman's study of the chronoground iconography at Jayabageshwari Temple does not mention the carvings of the chronogrounds on the temple door flanks, seen in the upper right-hand corner, or the chronoground siddhas on the roof struts, seen on the left, wearing the Nath-style bowler hat and the Singna Jainus around the whistle around the neck, with the details in the bottom right. Not only does the Jayabageshwari temple clearly demonstrate the association between the 8 chronogrounds and the 8 siddhas, it also evidences some of the Buddhist not Shaiva hybridity that will become a recurring theme throughout this paper. For example, as Bunneman first noted, the temple and mural are ostensibly Shaiva in orientation, yet they depict the 8 chronogrounds as described in Buddhist tantras, save for the addition of a Shivalinga in each chronoground as noted above. Further, the chronoground siddhas, whose grouping originally developed out of Buddhist tantric art and literature, are depicted as Nath yogis, wearing Singna Jainus and Nath-style bowler-like hats. Examples from the vicinity of Basantapur, Dover Square. This cross-sectarian hybridity is also evident in Siddha images from several sites in and around Basantapur's Durbar Square. In the northern section of the Hanuman Doka Palace resides an ornate courtyard called Mohan Chok. At its center is an elaborate stepwell filled with a dazzling array of stone deities. Next slide, please. Around the courtyard's perimeter are 12 Siddhas and 8 Chanaground scenes carved in stone relief. Like the Siddha carvings at Jayabageshwari, the Mohan Chok Siddhas each wear the Singnai Jainu of an initiated Nath yogi. Furthermore, the group of 8 Siddhas is expanded to 12 to accommodate several other Siddhas also revered by the Nath yogis, like Minhapa or Matsyendranath and Kanhapa or Kanifnath. These Siddhas and Chanaground scenes form a mandalic circle around the central stepwell. Next slide. Directly northeast of Mohan Chok stands the majestic Taleju Bhavani Temple, a magnificent bronze-sheathed door intricately embellished with images of tantric deities adorns the temple's southern facade. Forming a border around the door are 12 Siddhas and 8 Chanaground scenes. While these Siddhas do not wear Singnai Jainus, the group of 8 Siddhas is nonetheless increased to 12 to include Siddhas favored by Nath yogis like Matsyendranath and Gorakshanath, just as in Mohan Chok. Again, note that the Chanagrounds and Siddhas form a mandalic circle encompassing the door's central deities. Additionally, the appearance of the images on a doorway demarcates a second mandalic boundary. That is, the threshold between the public space outside and the consecrated space inside the temple sanctum. Next slide. Further northeast from Taleju Bhavani Temple, there is yet another door bearing images of the 8 Chanaground Siddhas at Janabaha, also known as Seto Matsyendranath Temple. Unlike the Taleju temple door, the door at Janabaha does not depict Chanaground scenes, but here I contend that the 8 Siddhas nonetheless still symbolize the 8 Chanagrounds. While this site is primarily Buddhist in orientation, the fact that the temple's main deity, a form of Avalokiteshvara, is identified with none other than Matsyendranath, the first human guru of the Nath Sampradaya, suggests more of the cross-sectarian hybridity that is by now becoming a recurring theme. Next slide. At Mubaha, another Buddhist vihara directly south of Janabaha, yet another set of 8 Chanaground Siddhas adorns wooden pillars just inside the vihara's entryway. Whereas many of the Chanaground Siddha images examined previously mark the threshold entering into a temple, the placement of the Siddhas at Mubaha is such that devotees are more likely to notice them as they exit the vihara, thus signifying to the devotee that they are departing from Mubaha's mandala and re-entering into the public world. Next slide. Finally, back in Basantapur Durbar Square, wooden roof struts bearing images of 8 or possibly more Chanaground Siddhas previously adorned the Bimaleshwar or Naudega temple prior to its collapse during the 2015 earthquake. Nonetheless, these intricately carved roof struts are still preserved at the Hanuman Doka Palace Museum. Once again, Matsyendranath or Minapa is included among the Siddhas. Having examined numerous examples from the Basantapur area, let us now shift our attention to the old city of Patan in Lalitpur. Examples from the vicinity of Patan Durbar Square. Next slide. The southern structure of the Patan Durbar Square Palace is called Sundari Chok. On its western facade, wooden relief carvings of 8 Chanaground Siddhas flanks the southernmost doorway. Like Mohan Chok in Basantapur, the Sundari Chok courtyard contains an ornate stepwell filled with images of the royal family's favorite deities. Thus, as we have seen before, the Chanaground Siddha's association with doorways entering into consecrated spaces emphasizes their role as peripheral boundary makers. Next slide. The palatial building immediately north of Sundari Chok is called Mul Chok. Here, an incomplete set of Chanaground Siddhas adorns wooden roof struts on the west-facing facade and inside the Mul Chok courtyard. Among the most innovative elements seen at Mul Chok is the appearance of this 4-armed Virupa. His first 2 hands display the usual gestures, holding a skull cup with one and pointing to the sun with the other. The second 2 hands hold a vajra and bell, which are central to Tantric Buddhist ritual and symbolism. Since Virupa, also known in Nepal as Virupaksha, appears frequently in both Buddhist and Hindu literature produced in Nepal, perhaps Buddhist artisans added the hands with vajra and bell to symbolically bolster Virupa's Buddhist credentials. Alternatively, the image could be combining the iconography of both Virupa and Gantapa, another common Chanaground Siddha who usually holds a vajra and bell and who often raises one arm in a manner similar to Virupa. Thus, the 4-armed Virupa could represent both Siddhas, especially since Gantapa does not appear elsewhere in Mul Chok. Or perhaps Virupa's forearms hold some other significance. Either way, this enigmatic forearm Virupa image warrants further study. Next slide. Upstairs inside Mulchok is a room called the Vidyapit, which formerly held the royal family's tantric shrine or for private worship. Now, part of the palace museum, the room still houses a wooden altar cabinet embellished with relief carvings of the 8 Charnaground Siddhas. The Siddhas form a mandalic border that would have encircled whichever deities were placed inside the altar cabinet. Next slide. Outside the palace, an incomplete set of 6 Charnaground Siddhas adorns the Timpaniya or Toranas on the northern and eastern side of the nearby Vishwanath temple in Patandurva Square. Given that this is an ostensibly Shaiva temple, it is perhaps unsurprising to find images of Matsyendranath and Gorakshanath, to whom Nath yogis are particularly partial, included here among the Charnaground Siddhas, just as we have seen in some of the examples from Basantapur. That the Siddhas appear in the lower left and lower right corners of the Toranas, flanking the other more central deities, further attests to their symbolic role as peripheral boundary makers. Like the images on the Taliju temple door described above, the Siddhas on the Vishwanath temple Toranas demarcate mandalic space on at least 2 levels. First, they symbolize the charnel grounds that encompass the mandalas of deities depicted on the Toranas themselves. Secondly, they symbolize the imaginary charnel grounds that encircle the entire temple itself, signifying to devotees that to walk beneath the Torana arches is to enter into the temple's mandala. Next slide. Just north of Vishwanath Temple, at the northern entrance of Patandurva Square, is the Saraswati Palcha, a small colonnaded resting platform bearing an image of the goddess Saraswati. An incomplete set of Charnaground Siddhas adorns the platform's wooden pillars. It may be that both the Vishwanath Temple and the Saraswati Palcha may have each originally showcased complete sets of 8 or more Charnaground Siddhas that were later rendered incomplete due to successive renovation projects. However, more evidence is necessary to make such a determination. Next slide. Northwest from Patandurva Square stands the well-known Kwabaha, or Golden Temple, among the most famous Buddhist viharas in all of Nepal. 7 of the 8 Charnaground Siddhas appear on the wooden roof struts inside the temple courtyard directly above the main entryway. This example is reminiscent of Mubaha as described previously, and that these siddhas are more likely to be seen when exiting the vihara than when entering. Next slide. Finally, since we began with the painted mural of Bhairava at Jayabageshwari, it seems appropriate to conclude our exploration of the Charnaground Siddhas with yet another painted example associated with Bhairava, this time at the Tyanga Bhairava or Tika Bhairava temple, several blocks east of Kwabaha in Patan. On certain holidays, the priests of the Tyanga Bhairava temple display an antique scroll painting, or palba, of Bhairava just behind the temple's central lingam. In a manner reminiscent of the Taliju temple door, the perimeter of the palba is bordered with images of the Charnagrounds and Siddhas. Note that I have elected to blur the central portion of the photograph because the palba is regarded as the living receptacle of the deity and is only displayed on certain occasions. Nonetheless, the border bearing images of the Charnagrounds and Siddhas is still visible. However, due to its age, the palba has faded and peeled significantly, such that only 4 Siddhas are presently visible. Other Nepalese Siddha images as makers of sacred space. We're nearly done here. Next slide. Besides the groupings of Charnaground Siddhas, images of individual Siddhas or small groups of Siddhas are occasionally used to demarcate sacred space elsewhere in and around the Kathmandu Valley. For example, statues of 3 Siddhas, namely Gorakshanath, Matsyendranath, and Virupaksha, seen at the top here, sit within the upper windows of the Unmata Bhairava temple inside the Indrashwar complex in Panauti. Here, the Siddhas signify the location status as a sacred site or tirtha associated with local narratives like the Sachitirtha Mahatmya section of the Himavat Khanda. Similarly, images of several Siddhas inside a small temple atop the Mrigastali hill near Pashupatinath, seen at the bottom here, mark the location as a gathering site for adepts or a Siddhapita, associated with the stories of the Mrigastali Mahatmya section of that same Himavat Khanda, which is attributed to the Skanda Purana. Finally, the famous, next slide. Finally, the famous Swayambhu Mahachaitya complex hosts an assortment of Buddhist siddhas carved in stone relief, including Virupa, Padmasambhava, Songyungheraka, and others. These images likely commemorate each siddha's visit to or association with this most sacred of Nepalese Buddhist sites. Some concluding thoughts on siddhas as space makers. Whereas images of the Charnaground siddhas demarcate sacred space through their association with the 8 peripheral Charnagrounds, the assorted siddha images at Indrashwar, Mrigastali, and Swayambhu, the last images we've seen here, seem to garner much of their sacralizing power from their association with popular narratives of place. In this way, the siddha's power to make places and spaces is not restricted to art and architecture or I should say visual art and architecture, as siddhas often play a similar role in narrative literature and folklore. For example, Tony Huber has noted the role siddha narratives have played in propagating the cult of Indian Pitas in Tibet. Similarly, my own doctoral research on the Siddha Virupa or Virupaksha has revealed fascinating works like the Virupaksha Tirtha Yatra, a Sanskrit text in which the character of Virupa is used as a narrative device to map the 64 Tirthalingas of Nepal, as well as the Goreka Samhita, an old Odia text in which the character of Virupa, here called Virupaksha, is similarly utilized to map the sacred sites of Odisha. As such, the Siddha's power to demarcate sacred space across multiple media is now well established. Perhaps one reason siddhas are so popular as place and space makers is their very humanness. As humans, albeit perfected ones, the siddhas act as trailblazers, inviting devotees to follow in their footsteps and offering devotees the tantalizing possibility of becoming siddhas themselves. On that note, I will conclude this paper by citing the last lines of a famous Tibetan, not Nepalese, but Tibetan prayer to the Siddha Padmasambhava, which eloquently expresses this very sentiment of inviting the devotee to follow in the Siddha's footsteps, when it says, Keki Jesu da drupchi, jinji lapchir sheksu sol. Practicing in your footsteps, I pray, come grant your blessings. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. At this time, I'd invite the panelists to ask any questions you might have, and I'll share my thoughts at the end.
I've got a couple questions for you. So first, very interesting. Thank you. Is there any Nepali religious hybridity regarding Bodhanath or Pashupatinath? Because when I think of charnel grounds here in Kathmandu, the first thing to come up is, of course, Pashupatinath. And do we see some of these sort of innovations in our own neighborhood here?
This is a wonderful question. With Bodhanath, frankly, I'm not qualified to say. With Pashupatinath, absolutely. On one of the last slides that I showed here, there's a small temple on top of the Mrigastali hill, just behind Pashupatinath, that has images of Virupa or Virupaksha, along with Matsyendranath, Goraknath, etc. And there's a number of local narratives that sort of associate Virupaksha even in Hindu scriptures with both Vajrayogini and with the Natha Sampradaya, and sort of locates some of that hybridity occurring on top of the Mrigastali hill. There's another image at Pashupatinath, which is possibly one of the most famous so-called Virupaksha images in Nepal that I actually didn't include in my presentation. It's on the Ghat, just inside or just outside, down the stairs from the main Pashupatinath shrine, in a small little kuti or shrine building. And it is identified as Virupaksha, and it is associated with several sort of hybrid Buddhist Shaiva narratives about Virupaksha. But I have some doubts about that identification. Obviously, the name Virupaksha is also hybrid in its own right, because Virupaksha is also a name for Shiva. Virupaksha means, Virupa means sort of ugly or strange or deformed. And in this case, the Virupaksha means sort of deformed eye, meaning that the fact that Shiva has a third eye. So Virupaksha is a common name, especially in some of the earlier Shaiva traditions. Virupaksha is also a common name for Shiva. And we see this recurring even in the Buddhist stories about Shiva. In one case, when he's about to prostrate to the the lingam in Bhimeshwar in Andhra Pradesh, he says, you know, oh, there's no tradition in which the older brother prostrates to the younger brother, sort of suggesting that he is Shiva's brother, right? And there's one quote in some of the Tibetan versions where when he's in Varanasi, one king says, is he a Buddhist yogi? Is he a Brahmin, a Hindu Brahmin? Or is he Mahadev himself? We can't tell because he's sitting in meditation with such tapas, we can't even tell. So across the literature, we see this. And so some of these stories are mapped onto this image at Pashupatinath on the Ghats. But I have some doubts about whether this is actually depicting the Shiva Virupaksha or whether this may be like an early sort of Yaksha-esque depiction of Shiva as Virupaksha, onto which later Virupaksha Siddha narratives are sort of conflated and mapped. So that's the only reason I didn't include it here. But there are several images of definitively of the sort of sun-stopping image of Virupa at Pashupatinath. And I live at a Sakya monastery, and when I even tell that to my sort of Sakya brethren, who Virupa is regarded as one of the patriarchs of the Sakya tradition, even there are like, really? You know, like, really? There's Virupas at Pashupatinath? So anyways, I invite you to go see for yourself.
And one more question. Could you explain some more about the significance of the Siddhas, Nagas, Virupa, and the magicians that were on the periphery of the mandalas on your first slide? Did they act as protectors? Because from what I understood, that it was like, you know, it's a call to follow in the Siddha's footsteps, yet they're located on the periphery of the mandala rather than in the center.
Yeah. So that's a wonderful question. Thank you. My sort of claim about or suggestion or hypothesis that maybe one of the sort of space and placemaking powers of the Siddhas is derived from that sort of follow in my footsteps sort of thing is probably better attested in the narrative literature aspect of things. Whereas the depictions of the Siddhas on the peripheral of the boundary or the sort of peripheries of mandalas alongside Nagas and Chaityas, like there's 8 Chaityas, 8 mountains, 8 clouds, 8 different kinds of trees. And as I said, the earliest narrative literature doesn't actually name which Siddhas are in the different 8 charna grounds, but the 8 charna grounds do have names. Later commentarial and narrative literature definitely does associate specific siddhas with specific charna grounds. One of the first texts to actually do that is a text ascribed to none other than Virupa. There is some debate about what the why they're depicted there, other than the fact of the idea that it's a charna ground and yogis practice in charna grounds. And some scholars think that maybe this is meant to represent siddhas that held particular yogini tantra lineages that sort of are significant lineages. You know, Dombi Heruka and Virupa are associated with Hevajra, Gantapa, and others are associated with Chakrasamvara Tantra. And so there's some suggestion that maybe they were included more to sort of signify the coming together of all of these different lineages. But yeah, I hope that maybe gets somewhere towards your question.
Just a quick question for clarification, because this is delightfully new to me, a lot of the information that you're giving. But you mentioned the other, the different kinds of peripheral deity, you know, or how did you refer to them? Yeah, the deities. So the Dikpala and the Ashtamatrika.
Yeah.
So these are 2 different kinds, and could you talk about their function with respect to, you know, the marking of the sacred space and how they're different than the
Sure. The fact that you picked on both the Dikpalas and the Matrikas is actually particularly revealing in a certain way, because those are 2 sets of semi-divine or divine beings that are not just associated with the Buddhist tradition. So, like the Dikpalas, for instance, sort of arise out of the Vedic or sort of semi-pseudo post-Vedic tradition. But in the Buddhist tantras, they're considered oath-bound. So they've sort of been bound by oath by a Buddha or a Siddha or the central deity in the mandala to say, okay, now that you sort of have been subjugated into the Buddhist fold, you're now going to protect these eight directions. But it is very reminiscent of other sort of Vedic and post-Vedic rites of establishing sacred circles or protection circles in which those same directional protectors would be invoked. Similarly, the Ashtamatrika are also another group of semi-divine figures that are not just associated with Buddhism, are actually probably most known outside of the Buddhist fold. The Ashtamatrika start to appear in artistic representations of the 8 smashanas or 8 charna grounds quite early. By that, I mean, sorry, off the top of my head, maybe around 13th, 14th century. I could be maybe a little bit wrong on that, but certainly by the 17th century, certainly way before the 17th century, which is what I'm talking about here. But they're not explicitly, they're not so widely attested in literary sources, Buddhist tantras talking about the beings in the smashanas, the Dikpalas, the Nagas, the Chaityas, the trees, the rivers, the mountains, the clouds, the wizards and siddhas, although not given by name in the earliest tantras, but at least mentioned. Those are all there, but again, I think probably the mapping on of the Ashtabhairavas and the Ashtamatrikas, which are most well known outside of the Buddhist tradition, probably get added into Himalayan artistic depictions of the 8 charna grounds, precisely because of this number 8, right, or 10, and this association with the mandalic circle, the 8 directions, or the 10 directions being the 8 directions plus up and down. And so I think it just sort of becomes natural to map these other groups of 8 sort of peripheral beings, to just throw them in the charna grounds and say, hey, they're there too, you know.
More the merrier.
The more the merrier, right? It's a charna ground party.
Right, thank you very much. Very informative. Our last speaker for this panel is Hilda Mölsä, who is a graduate student at RYI in Buddhist Studies, and who is going to present on her work on Yogacara and the literal creation of Pure Lands. Also, Hilda is an accomplished photographer and does bring in a creative, performative aspect of her engagement and her own studies in Buddhism. Please, Hilda.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for a very generous introduction. And thanks for coming to my presentation. Thanks also to my fellow panelists for such wonderful presentations. It's quite hard to come on after all of that. So I'm not really a scholar, I'm a mere BA student. And today I will talk about a little snippet of my BA thesis that I've been working on during this semester. Initially, my aim was to just focus on Buddha realms, and but then, while I was researching, I ran into all sorts of stuff that was very interesting, and then somehow it all just kind of came together and turned out to be related. So I guess if there's just one takeaway from my presentation today, it's that I'm really into this stuff. So imagine a view of deep space through the Hubble telescope. The Hubble telescope allows us to catch a glimpse of a multiplicity of galaxies and dimensions across the universe, like the number of grains in the sand of Ganges. It's pretty neat. Next slide, please. A similar multitude of dimensions and realms can be found in Buddhist cosmology. One of the most widely known representations of Buddha realms is the Western Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha, also known as Sukhavati in Sanskrit or Devachen in Tibetan. Amitabha's land will function as an anchor point in this presentation. Rebirth in Amitabha's land entails the devotee being reborn inside a lotus flower, floating in a tranquil, paradisiacal realm, free from suffering, war, and turmoil. The air is resonating with Buddhist teachings coming from Amitabha himself, seated in the center of this realm and surrounded by an infinite retinue of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The longer Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, in addition to describing the Pure Land of Amitabha in great detail, also gives detailed description of Mahayana Buddhist cosmology. According to the sutra, the universe consists of countless Buddha realms in all directions, equal to the sand in the Ganges, each with its own sun, moon, and stars. The worlds are arranged in tiers, with some worlds situated higher than others. At the top of this hierarchy is the Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha. Next slide, please. The creation of Sukhavati is linked to the bodhicitta of Amitabha Buddha, and some sources, such as Gorchen Rinpoche, say that Sukhavati is actually a state of bodhicitta. And here is also a part of Amitabha's vows related to the creation of his pure realm. I will have a magnificent field, the best and the highest. And in this most noble, beautified high seat of awakening will be found the incomparable bliss of the state of nirvana. And I will purify this field so that in it all living beings will reach nirvana. In the longer Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, you can find descriptions of Amitabha's previous life as the compassionate monk Dharmakara, who, upon hearing the teachings of the Buddha, embodied Amitabha and vowed to liberate all beings who merely called his name. This is why Sukhavati is typically regarded as a path of easy practice. Merely by remembering the name Amitabha, one is said to gain rebirth in his realm. Next slide. Buddhist scriptures provide vast and lavish descriptions of world systems spanning across multiple universes. A pure realm or a Buddha field is an otherworldly abode, purified and overseen by its respective Buddha or Bodhisattva. Accessing a pure realm functions as a stepping stone to enlightenment. It is an ideal environment for the study and practice of Buddhist teachings. This practice is built on two main pillars: devotion to the Guru and adeptness in visualization. So it's a very highly visual practice. The visual layout of a pure realm is similar to an autonomous solar system, if you like that, or a mandala, if you prefer that, circling around one Siddham deity. A multiplicity of such dimensions spanning across the Buddhist cosmos may be found in sources such as the Buddha Vatamsaka Sutra, more specifically from two of its chapters, the Dashabhumika and the Gandhavyuha. In the Dashabhumika, one will find descriptions of the 10 bhumis of the Bodhisattva and the myriad worlds available to them, while the Gandhavyuha provides a kaleidoscopic journey through the Buddhist cosmos. Both depict great multitudes of Buddhas across the universe, each Buddha having countless manifestations simultaneously present across different world realms. These depictions are not only limited to the cosmological locations of different Buddha fields, but they also include descriptions of their ecological systems, topography, and architecture, as well as the spiritual community, repertoire of Buddhist teachings and ceremonies. Although there are both terrestrial pure realms, such as Bodha, Bodh Gaya, and Potala, and extraterrestrial pure realms, such as Amitabha's Sukhavati, Vairochana's Akanishta, or Akshobhya's Abhirati, really what they are analogous to is the pure nature of the mind. In Yogacara, the mind is also represented as a mandala, the nature of the mind being the luminous center. Thus, purifying a Buddha realm could also be interpreted as purifying one's mind. And here is an Amitabha's mandala. Next slide, please. And a couple more depictions of Amitabha and Sukhavati. Amitabha practice, like other related Buddha realm practices, is connected to the Tathagata Garbha theory, which posits that all sentient beings possess a Buddha nature that can be unveiled through practice. The practitioner of Amitabha sadhana eventually recognizes their own nature as Amitabha Buddha. However, there are mixed views about this practice across Yogacara thinkers. While the Ratnagotra Vibhaga ends with an invocation of Amitabha, the Mahayana Samgraha displays polemics against the Pure Land approach. For instance, because of the relative ease of this practice, critiques attributed to Asanga and Vasubandhu rejected Amitabha practice as something only suitable for spiritually inferior and morally indolent people in the Mahayana Samgraha and its commentary. This is because these Yogacara thinkers were concerned about the practical implications of some interpretations of the Pure Land approach and aimed to deny the practical legitimacy and emphasize the importance of realizing the illusory nature of all concepts and entities, including Amitabha and his Pure Land. However, for me, at least, this argument seems to overlook the goal of Amitabha practice, which aims towards this very realization. In Yogacara, mental constructions are seen as the basis of all mental and physical events, and they arise from the interplay between consciousness and its objects. Mental constructions, or vikalpa, can take many forms, including language, images, and conceptual frameworks, and as such can lead to confusion and suffering when not realized as inherently empty and dependent on the mind. The construction of a pure realm also involves mental constructions, but the difference is that the practitioner is actively aiming towards realization by using these constructions as a tool on the way. The Dashabhumika Sutra emphasizes that the process of dependent arising does not involve any active agents, experiences, or actions, but is solely a result of the workings of the mind. The term Chittamatra, which Christian Lindner suggests is almost a synonym of vikalpa, highlights the illusory nature of the dualistic perception created by the mind. Next slide, please. From the connection between Buddha realms and the natural state of the mind, often described as luminous and all-pervasive, arises what is called creative intuition, or pratibha. Pratibha is a natural function of the mind that arises when the mind is free from conditioning of habitual patterns and concepts, often translated as to shine upon or to become manifest. Pratibha is an irreducible event of understanding, according to the grammatical philosophy of the 5th century Indian philosopher and linguist Bhartrhari. Interestingly, the name Amitabha also points to luminosity, and incidentally, both the practice as well as the etymological origins of Amitabha suggest earlier forms of solar worship assimilated into a Buddhist framework. This is likely due to the polyethnic and multi-religious environment of the Kushana Empire, during which the Sukhavati Vyuha Sutras were composed. So this suggests Persian, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian influences. Both names Amitabha, infinite light, and Amitayus, infinite life, derive from the same Sanskrit root, Amita or Amrita or immortal. Tibetan counterparts usually translate Amitabha as Öpakme and Amitayus as Tsepakme. Amitabha is luminous like the sun, and in him, luminosity takes on what Georgios Halkias calls a cosmological dimension invested with soteriological power. Further, in the longer Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, Amitabha's halo is described as greater in size than hundreds of thousands of millions of trillions of Buddha fields. Next slide, please. To return to Pratibha, it is associated with the arts, especially poetry or kavya, as the source of inspiration and creativity. Poetry has also played an important role in the development of the cult of Amitabha. Devotional poetry attributed to Tibetan Buddhist funerary rites at Dunhuang, dating back to the 8th to 10th centuries, place an emphasis on securing rebirth in a divine realm conducive for Buddhist teachings and equate Sukhavati to Dharmadhatu, free from all obscurations, a completely purified state of mind. Thus, it seems that the actual location of Sukhavati lies beyond the conceptualizing mind. Like creative intuition, Sukhavati arises in the natural state of the mind, and in a cyclical manner, luminosity, creativity, and visualization practice perpetuate each other. In the Yogacara tradition, since all perceptions and experiences arise from the alaya vijnana, it is the foundation of all mental activity as well as the source of creative intuition. Creative intuition could be seen as a manifestation of the alaya that stores all seeds and potentials that can manifest as thoughts and emotions. The human mind is thus not just a passive receptor of stimuli, but an active constructor of reality. Thus, luminosity feeds creativity, and we could say that the nature of mind is creative. Next slide, please. To return to Pratharhari, he believes that Pratibha cannot be conveyed to others as this is that or idam tat iti, but it is beyond description even for the one who experiences it. In the Tibetan tradition, this is likened to yogic perception or yogic pratyaksha, described in terms of self-awareness by Shakya Chokdan. According to Douglas Duckworth, when self-awareness is combined with yogic pratyaksha or pratibha, a shift occurs in the way that knowledge is defined. Instead of being viewed as a definitive judgment, it becomes ineffable knowledge. This differentiation is evident in Tibetan, which uses vijnana or namshe to refer to conventional cognition and jnana or yeshe to denote ultimate cognition. Unlike vijnana, jnana is truly non-conceptual, as even sensory perceptions in vijnana are somewhat conceptual and thus dualistic. Pratibha, on the other hand, refers to intuitive knowledge that arises spontaneously and effortlessly from within. Pratibha is also considered to be beyond ordinary processes, and it's not influenced by external factors. The notion of pratibha could be seen as pure, non-dual state of mind, cultivated through meditation practice and capable of intuitively constructing a purified Buddha realm or the natural state of the mind for one to abide in. Next slide, please. So here is one of the earliest Amitabha inscriptions, to my knowledge. It is in Brahmi script, and it says Buddhasya Amitabhasya of Amitabha Buddha, and I just thought it was really cool, so I put it there.
That's awesome.
So yeah, and then on to my last slide. To close, I wanted to give you another cool picture of deep space. This is captured by the James Webb telescope this time. And this picture shows what is called gravitational lensing. And it happens when large objects, such as galaxies and galaxy clusters, warp space-time for the path of light, making it visibly bent, like you see in there, and appearing multiple times in the image. So to put it simply, in this picture, you can see space-time. And I thought it was pretty neat, so I wanted to share it. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Hilda, and sorry for my misstatement. I said MA and not BA, but shows my esteem for you. Panelists, any comments or questions for Hilda? Go ahead.
I can sort of riff a little bit. It's not a concrete question, but thank you for a delightful presentation. One of the things that struck me that I was trying to formulate into a question is the idea of creating a pure land in one's mind. There's a tension, it seems to me, between this idea that of the Hubble telescope, where it's sort of a scientific thing where you're looking and seeing something that is there, whereas the Pure Land itself, at least in the meditative visualization process, is something creative. And when I read your paper, I was wondering whether you had explored this double aspect of the Pure Land. It's at once a cosmological realm and something which is created, which is a little bit different than perhaps not, but it seems a little bit different than the analogy of looking through a telescope.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good and valid comment. Yeah, I thought, well, while I was researching pure realms, the way that they appeared to me in their multiplicity was kind of like the galaxies through the telescope. So I wanted to convey that image through those means. And I thought also, well, since, well, if you're reading a paper, you cannot see these visual cues. If I ask you to just imagine it, then you're creating the Buddha realm, you're also creating the image of this multiplicity of galaxies and infinite space.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I think my question sort of reveals a kind of modern Western set of assumptions about the nature of reality, and so I carry that into my questions. But when I think about some of the scholars writing about early Buddhist cosmology, like Rupert Getton and psychology, I mean, I think that we have to keep in mind is this idea that this bifurcation that we made today, that between the objective realm and the psychological realm was not made in the same way, or if at all, in the earlier tradition. So in the context of the jhanas, for example, you're at once going into the mind and going into different spheres, right? I mean, it's not, so I just wanted to bring that out. Like, so for your, in the case of the Pure Land, it could be something very similar, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's valid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned how there were certain, I think you said specified them as yogacara sort of opponents of particular Pure Land notions, and I suppose I can probably intuit what some of those might have been, especially if we look towards sort of more East Asian iterations of the Pure Land tradition become very much emphasizing sort of only Amitabha's will as being the pure agent in deciding who gets to go there or not, and even no effort on the individual's part. Obviously, the Yogacara authors or thinkers you're talking about are probably more South Asian than East Asian, but still I can sort of intuit maybe what some of their critiques might have been in terms of this sort of emphasis on illusoriness. I'm just curious, you mentioned that you might have some sort of defenses against that, and you touched on it a little bit. I'm just curious, what were some of the defense? Have you read any defenses written by sort of proponents of Pure Land ideologies, and like sort of how they talk about it? And if not, and on top of that, sort of what would your sort of defense be a little bit more elaborately if you
Sure, I think that's a really good question, and I've been thinking about that a lot. There are differing views about the relative ease or non-ease of accessing Pure Land. So on one hand, sure, it is said that just by remembering Amitabha, you'll get there, and even if you're a wrongdoer, you get there, and blah, blah, blah. But then there are other sources who claim, like Garchen Rinpoche, for example, when, well, giving his Hoa instructions, he was saying like, oh, well, you need to be at least an 8th Bhumi Bodhisattva. So you actually need to have like a pretty high level of realization if you take it like that. So yeah, and then there are other sources. I remember Kamala Sheila said that you have to be on the 10th Bhumi. So it's, yeah.
One thing that came to mind is that heaven is a major selling point in the spread of most religions. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more about the role that Shukavati plays for a Buddhist. Is it merely a heaven? Why is it important for a Buddhist to get to Shukavati, to supplicate to Amitabha and get there?
Well, if you look at the notion of heaven from like a Christian perspective, then that's like the end goal. You go there and then you spend eternity there. Whereas in the case of Sukhavati, it's more like a stepping stone. So you go to Sukhavati with the intention of perfecting your practice and becoming eventually enlightened. So it's really just a stepping stone on the way to enlightenment. It's not an end goal itself. It's just a conducive environment.
That in some ways that sort of makes me think about sort of maybe some connections between the notion of the Bayul as being like a safe and productive place to practice, and then obviously they're very different sort of ideas, but also it just sort of
Quite similar,
yeah calls to mind a similar thread between both of your presentations, that as being this sort of like really great place to practice and to a sort of a safe space to that to get there maybe a little easier than amidst all of this, whatever this is.
Wonderful. Actually, very nice segue into my own response, if I may. One moment, please. I made a lot of changes as I was listening to these wonderful papers, so I hope you'll bear with my reflections in process, which is, very much along the lines of the content of what I have to say here. The papers presented here can be tied together under the rubric of performance, specifically the enacting and the creation of worlds. As with the panels we heard yesterday, our speakers here emphasize the importance of individual agency and creativity in the formation of our shared reality, our shared worlds. The title of the panel, Beings and Their Environments, reflects this, but also builds on it. Taken together, our papers give us the opportunity to reflect on the following idea. Are we individually, collectively acting within a physical space, which is given in the analytic philosophical usage of that term, are always already present? Is the physical space given? Is it in some meaningful sense external, or is something else going on altogether? To reference a now, quote, old movie, which dates me as well, pervasively discussed in philosophy classes during my undergraduate studies, The Matrix. I can ask the panelists, how deep does the rabbit hole go? To what extent are we literally creating space versus acting within space? And how do we think meaningfully about that as scholars, as practitioners, if that's what we are, and so forth? So, stated differently, these papers encourage us to constructively consider the ways in which Buddhist teachings are performed, studied, and described as situated beings. They do so in ways that go beyond a theoretical and potentially disinterested engagement with Buddhist teachings. As a whole, these presentations invite us to question, again, just how strong, how central a role we play, again, individually and collectively, in the creation and transmission of space, of Buddhist doctrine, of the teachings, and of the path. This also invites us to reflect on the extent to which sentient beings, particularly humans, play a participatory role in this creation, in our shared experiences. I submit that the papers also encourage us to take seriously the notion articulated, I think most explicitly in the Kalachakra Tantra, that we do literally create the world. Specifically, The Kalachakra challenges us to consider that this seemingly physical world might be the product of our individual and our collective karma. At the same time, there has to be some element of what I would call always already enlightenment, perhaps better known as Buddha nature. Right? This Buddha nature, this quality allows us to conceive, excuse me, allows us to conceive a quite different source for the world, the physical experience world, as sentient beings, besides the karmic, besides the karmic, and likewise, I would note the Kalachakra, like the Yogacara teachings that Hilda was focusing on, offer these sources are very much absent. The discussion of these sources as literally physical is generally absent, right? It's not atoms that were just there and our consciousness is epiphenomenal and so forth, right? According to the Kalachakra, according to Yogacara, we do quite literally create this world with our karma, along with our Buddha nature, our base of empty luminosity, upon which bodhisattvas, Buddhas, and perhaps meekly, humbly ourselves can make aspirations and act ethically in order to encounter spaces and create different spaces. So both ideas, our potential luminosity, Buddha nature, as well as our aspirations, are necessary for the creation of the spaces in which we live. And because of that, rather than only focusing on or thinking about the physical, the atomistic, or the karmic world, we can imagine other possible worlds, myriad worlds even, to quote the title of one of Kongtrul's chapters from the Sheijutsu, pure worlds. So I would invite our speakers, I'll say more, but I invite our speakers to consider, if you'd like to respond, push back, elaborate, how deep does the rabbit hole go exactly in your research, in your own estimation of Buddhist doctrine and presentation? So Martin Adams offers what I find to be a unique mode of engaging Buddhist studies and the Buddhist path. If I'm going on too long, please stop me. Describing his own process in developing a Buddhist musical, Martin invites us to consider the distinction between, as he puts it, a play about Buddhism versus a, quote, Buddhist play. Adams' work speaks primarily to a non-Buddhist audience and integrates various issues related to Buddhist studies as well as the performing arts. His presentation and his work in general emphasize the relationships between philosophy and the arts, and present ethical challenges in the presentation, the transmission, and the presentation and transmission of Himalayan Buddhism to this primarily non-Himalayan audience. He presents his play, What the Buddha Never Taught, based on Tim Ward's Behind the Robes, which looks at the embodiment and practice of monastics and lay practitioners in a Thai forest monastery. In thinking through this crucial difference, a play about Buddhism versus a Buddhist play, Adams mentions emptiness, right speech, and other core Buddhist doctrines and values, thinking through not just their presentation to the audience, but also their role in the creation of such presentations. In this spirit, Adams tells us that the play is intended to help the audience, quote, explore Buddhism for oneself. Characters embody Buddhist themes such as reification, nihilism, the two extremes, and so forth. Keep losing my place, sorry. On a personal level, Adams presents to us his own process, his enactment of this Buddhist play. He invites us to join him in grappling with the terms and the implications of this process. He informs us that the upshot of this is Adams' own recognition of the need to embody Kushala Dharma in order to responsibly represent Buddhism. We need to embody virtuous, good action in order to represent that virtuous, good action. His reflections prompt me personally to investigate the critical distinction of stating versus showing in communicating Buddhist principles, as well as the life world of the Buddhists represented in his adaptation. I would ask Martin to share some reviews, feedback, let me restate. I would ask Martin to share some of the reviews, some of the feedback, possibly from Tim Ward, the author of that book, from audiences about the success, the challenges, and the surprises he might have faced in that endeavor. Andrew Hallahan has informed us about the relations between otherworldly realms, paradise, utopia, pure land. He relates these to Beul, a unique hybrid form of space that is all at once visualized and, quote, real. On the way, he offers specific commentary on the nature, really the lack of maps, of physical maps in the pre-modern worlds of Nepal and Tibet. His talk begins with a quote, which he just shared again. Heaven is a major selling point in the marketing of most religions. This rubric is useful in no small part due to the general orientation away from some idealized or eternal heaven, which is the result of our deeds, good or bad, in this single lifetime. Beul, Pita, pilgrimage site. Bringing these into conversation with the idea of utopia, a Greek term which means nowhere, I invite Andrew to reflect on the question of how Beul participates in the categories in which it's situated, as a terma, a treasure, as a pure land, as a pilgrimage space, and perhaps in an academic usage or perhaps English usage, a paradise. I'd also ask Andrew to speak a bit more off the cuff, to elaborate on his motivations for invoking John Milton's Paradise in Paradise Lost in this context, as well as the Orientalist, in my estimation, description of pure lands as Shangri-La, as a kind of hidden space for, according to Lost Horizon, European or quote Western treasures, arts, culture. Yes, to discuss Paradise Lost, Pure Lands, particularly Shambhala, Shangri-La in these terms. Okay. Westin reminds us or informs us that we are currently in a specific situated mandala, which is available even to us, to ignorant beings. Within this mandala, there is an integration, a clear integration between Buddhist Tantra and Nath Sampradaya, lineages and practices and architecture. Westin's paper invites us to appreciate Nepal as a macro mandala, which contains the mesocosms within, the representations, the constructions of sacred space, as well as the naturally occurring or Svayambhu sacred sites and self-arising images, such as the Svayambhu Tara at Parping, which are all within this macro mandala. As with Andrew's paper, Westin invites us to engage with literary and oral descriptions as important sources for the physically engaged, for the physically created world. Devotees are invited, Westin tells us, to enter certain sacred spaces within the Kathmandu Valley under the watchful eyes of the Vidyadharas and the Siddhas, which, as he helpfully informs us, often see us, so to speak, before we see them. As he said, we see them on the way out, not on the way in. I think that's quite telling, and I'd invite you to elaborate if you'd like. This is a clear demarcation, however, of the sacred space as a physical place versus non-sacred space, which brings up another crucial set in Tantric Buddhism, the set of outer, inner, and secret, in this case, sacred spaces. Secretly, of course, for adepts, all of the world is a pure land. It's any mountain is Mount Meru, and so forth. Advanced tantric practices, some invite us to see all walking as circumambulation in our lives, to see the physical world as a pure land that is literally the presentation of a Buddhist deity, a Yidam deity and Ishtadevata. In so doing, these practitioners are not convincing themselves of anything. They are recognizing a purity in the spaces in which they inhabit, which is, for most of us, tantalizingly just out of reach. So I invite Westin to elaborate on the ways these temples function, representing enlightenment versus causing, constructing, or creating it. I'd like to say that again, representing enlightenment as opposed to causing, creating, constructing it. Hilda's paper discusses the pure land of Sukhavati, understood through various sources, including some non-Buddhist sources from Sanskritic Persian, and so forth. Like the other talks here today, Hilda invites us to think about the literal creation of space, ethical, ontological, and most of all, performative space. Hilda also helpfully notes the porous boundaries between the physical and the metaphorical in Buddhist teachings. According to Hilda's sources, our ordinary actions and aspirations are already taking place within luminosity, which allows us to meaningfully engage samsara in a manner that purifies and curatively leads us to an experience of things as they really are, yatha bhuta darshana. Returning to the start and closing, I pose a question to all of our speakers. How deep does the rabbit hole go? Does the dictum found in the Dashabhumika and other scriptures, the triple world is mind alone, apply wholesale to the creation of physical spaces? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take my questions first, since you raised them first in the order of the talks given. Yeah, thanks for those comments and the questions you addressed to me about, I guess, in terms of reactions. And we had a little bit of a tiny bit of discussion about that before this morning, but I wanted to elaborate because I think it's very apropos that you ask about that. And given the fact that the play was directed towards these three audiences that I mentioned, including Buddhist studies scholars, so the academic response to the staged readings in the play were positive, and in general, one colleague was delighted to see, from his perspective, he wasn't a Buddhist studies scholar, but a religious studies scholar, but delighted, as he put it, that the play actually fairly represented Buddhist philosophy on stage, which he thought was quite an accomplishment in an entertaining manner. I had another colleague who is in Buddhist studies who saw it and also felt that it was very skillfully done. But there were issues, and not necessarily coming from the academic crowd. Surprisingly, in the process, some of the actors had issues. And what they had issues with were concerned representation. And in today's world, one has to walk very carefully about representing other cultures and speaking for other voice, and for someone, as I told you this morning when I gave my talk, I was very careful to try to avoid doing that. But I still included, and I mentioned in the talk that originally the monk who appeared at the end of the song, Yanaviro, was conceived to be a Nepali. And I wanted him to be an outsider to the Thai area. And I wanted him to basically provide a contrast to the confusion of the Western aspirants at the monastery. And I wanted to be Nepali partly out of affection for Nepal. And anyway, that just was a sentimental choice originally too. Now, what happened was the actor who was playing this monk refused to do it. He said, I won't play. He was a white guy. And he said, I won't play an Asian, and I said, well, I'm sure it's not going to offend anybody. I mean, people play, different, actors do this. This is what they do for a living. But he refused to do it. So we had a real dilemma at the 11th hour because he sort of sprung this on us, like a few days before opening night. So we had to think quickly about how to rewrite that character. It was quite the director was furious, but so anyway, I wasn't the director, as a producer. But the actor suggested that we make him another Canadian guy. And I thought, well, that's just going to totally change the dynamic between the lead character, Tim, and he said, and this monk, and so we had this dilemma. And in the middle of the night, I came up with an idea that we would actually totally change him so that he becomes, as I told you this morning, a monk of no fixed address, from everywhere, from nowhere, a vague sort of representation of the tradition. And his only role was to more or less to welcome Tim into the monastery and see him out at the end, and to speak a few verses from the Dhammapada. So it was fine. It worked out well. In fact, you could say it worked out best of all possible solutions, right? But that was an interesting point. The other one reviewer, just when it comes to representation, one reviewer critiqued the play by saying that it was guilty of tokenism because one of the lead characters was a Thai woman. She was actually a secondary character, but she came in, she was in the book and became a character in the play and part of the narrative. And we were so lucky to have a Thai young woman audition for the role, and she took it and she played it wonderfully. But because she was the only Asian actor in the play, I got criticized for tokenism. And said, well, the play is about a bunch of Western males. I mean, what can I do? So, you know, so this is the kind of thing that we're subject to these days, and it's coming out of a good intent. I don't know if there's a final solution to this kind of thing, but I welcome other people's comments. So those are my responses to your questions. Yeah.
Thanks. I guess I'll go next since we're going in order. Dan, to answer your question, how deep does the rabbit hole go? So let's think about it in terms of maps. Maps are not territory. They are a projection of our image of territory. And likewise, I mean, the Earth is round, so a map is putting this sort of territory on a flat surface. Perhaps that's why some people think the Earth is flat mistakenly. But again, if you were to just think that all of reality is mere projection, that we are just creating all of our surroundings, then perhaps you'd look at a map and say the Earth is flat, and then boom, the Earth is flat. But that's not true. There is a sort of dualistic co-arising that takes place that involves the state of reality as it is and the state of mind as it is. And perhaps we could turn to discourses on Dzogchen and Mahamudra to answer that sort of question about, you know, I think so. But I mean, just thinking about it in terms of my own presentation with maps, that's a good point to say that, like, yes, map is not territory, but if we were to accept that all reality is mere projection, then I think that maps would completely lose their usefulness in that sense.
I don't want to stymie conversation, but I also want to make sure people have a chance to respond. And then I think we'd all appreciate a few questions from the audience as well, if there's time after that.
Definitely. I'll just say something very, very briefly. Actually, if you can hand me the microphone, thank you. I'll just make one comment because I'd love to hear if there's any questions from the crowd. One, in addition to sort of many of the already cited Buddhist sources to sort of think about this, whether it's projection or co-arising or co-creation or the different ways of thinking about projecting truth, or one secondary source, academic book that has really helped me sort of think through a lot of this is David Schulman's More Than Real, in this notion of, particularly in the South Asian context, the importance of the sort of stepping outside of maybe certain Western notions or expectations about the distinction between narrative or artistic or imagined worlds versus being somehow less real than a so-called physical or atomic world where, as Schulman argues, I don't want to sort of misquote or put words in his mouth, but as I understand it, that at least in certain South Asian traditions, actually the sort of the imagined version or the projected version is actually considered in some way more real. And so I think that's really been a helpful sort of lens to look at some of this material.
Okay. Well, just to briefly address the question, how deep does the rabbit hole go? Maybe infinite, maybe it leads to other rabbit holes. Maybe there's a multiplicity of rabbit holes. Yeah, that's my point of view.
Thanks, everyone, for your feedback. Any comments, questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. I would like to say many things and discuss with you. Unfortunately, we do not have time, but at least it speaks to the quality that you're inspiring thought. That's very nice. So thank you for this. I try to make it like super short. So I have like one, as a direct response. So you're talking about this problem of appropriation. And I might wonder if you could comment on the fact that given the case that, like Buddhists have performed plays, thinking about the Lalita Vistara, just one among many Buddha Charita things to be meant to be performed, and then thinking about the fact that, basically the entire Tibetan Buddhist is cultural appropriation in that sense that they took Buddhism, thinking about these two things, maybe you could respond to possible critiques, thinking about what Buddhism actually does. And before you do, I would like to say two tiny small things more. So maybe you could answer the question about the paradise with regard to the fact that you talked about etymology. And so I think Paridesha, which basically just means enclosure, which comes from Avesta, which is older than Persian, and we find it in Sanskrit too, and there seems to be a shift, when we think about the adaptation in Greek, where it really gets a completely different meaning. So I was wondering if, given the fact that you opened up this idea, if it's really appropriate to try to enforce this term on what is there, talking about an enclosure or a garden effectively, if that really would make sense, or if it would not just foster more confusion. And there would be more, but I cannot do this. Sorry.
Okay, I'll try to be equally brief. Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Obviously, Buddhism has transformed itself many times historically, as Buddhism came into Tibet and new forms of art and commentary and all the rest evolved. And we can look at this play as very much consistent with that incredible flexibility that Buddhism has shown historically in coming into new cultural environments and taking on new forms, right? My challenge was to, in doing it like a Broadway style musical, is to make sure I did it right and do it well, so that it didn't turn into some sort of crass, cheapening, kind of shallow presentation of Buddhism just simply for entertainment, right? I wanted to be entertaining, surely it's, and that was a real challenge, but I wanted to be well informed and to capture the Buddhist themes that I thought were really very important. So I think I'm happy with the way it came out. I mean, there's always room for improvement. And of course, the challenge was working with a whole team of people who didn't have a background in Buddhism. So there was a choreographer, there's a director, a musical director, and then all the actors who had their own ideas about Buddhism. It was really very difficult, I can say, but the end result, I think, was a good presentation, a fair representation, and something that I have no regrets at all about. Yeah.
So to answer your question, why did I get into the etymological term of paradise? Because I wanted to take an anti-Orientalist approach to describing Beiyul as paradise. So I wanted to look into the roots of the word and understand where it comes from and why we are using it to describe it thusly. Because every single English translation of Nayik uses the word paradise, and popular renditions of Beiyul, such as Lost Horizon and Ian Baker's Expeditions, they always use the word paradise to describe what they've found. In fact, after Ian Baker published his work, the Chicago Tribune published in 1999, Shangri-La discovered, hidden Himalayan valley paradise discovered. And they used the word paradise. And this article appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune next to an article explaining calls for impeachment of Clinton with Monica Lewinsky. So this was a big story that millions of Americans read. So I thought that it would be worthwhile to criticize why we use that term. And I didn't know that it's even older than Persian. I'd love to talk to you about that a little bit. Here's some more. Thank you.
I have one more question. Okay. Yeah. I have a question particularly to Andy's talk, but maybe it inspires answers from other speakers about artificial intelligence in the realm of Buddhist studies. You showed us how you used artificial intelligence to create these Beiyul visually, and it was of course entertaining, also aesthetically appealing. Beyond that, what do you see as the significance and the contribution of artificial intelligence for Buddhist scholars? So far, what we've heard is mostly a danger looming at the horizon because artificial intelligence can produce our exam answers. So in your research, and maybe others have thought about it, which potentials, useful potentials, do you see in artificial intelligence for research and scholarship?
It's a very interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind would be mapping tools. So in descriptions, very, very old descriptions of Pemaka, they're described underground crystal lakes underneath the bend. And with the help of AI mapping software, they were able to locate where those underground lakes in Pemaka were, which is pretty amazing. I think you could use that for lots of mapping applications, such as 3D renditions of ancient temples, archaeological sites, things like that. And also brings to mind Anne's presentation yesterday, where they use software to digitally clean artwork without putting their hands or any tools on the artwork and potentially damaging it. So those are the biggest applications that come immediately to mind, but perhaps there's more.
Here's one final question before we break. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Tina.
just one comment. I'm pretty sure you're you know this work, but Lancaster did a lot of work with mapping that was kind of like the beginning of using this kind of technology, but I think they're further into that. So that might be interesting to look into.
Okay.
Great, thanks very much. I think probably many of us are hungry, and so we'll conclude our panel. Thank you very much for the conversation and the insights. Take that. And we return at 2 o'clock, 2:30? 2:30, okay.